Take number 9. Hey friends, this is my POWERMATIC table saw. I've had it for a little while now, and so I thought it would be good to go back and do a video of unboxing. And while I'm unboxing, I've got commentary on what I think of some of these things, and we'll put it together. And then at the end, I'll give another overview, standing here again with the same shirt on, telling you whether or not I like this thing and if I think it's any good.
Well, this is model PM1000, and I ordered it from Acme Tools in Plymouth, Minnesota. So here you'll see how it arrived.
All right, friends, so that's how the pallet came. Actually, a pallet on top of a pallet. Now we just got to start hauling some of these pieces in here that way. And maybe I'll leave it in the box for a bit until it gets to acclimating to the temperature within the box, so it doesn't get all humid and gross and sweaty and rusty right away. That's kind of a bad deal. So in the boxes, it's going to stay until it warms up. Well, friends, this is going to be my biggest purchase to date for anything woodworking related. A lot of what I have is either inherited or whatever. And no, I didn't steal it.
Let's tear into the goodies here. So we got a push stick, a manual or supplemental, whatever that thing is. We have a blade guard. Yeah. We got the riving knives, one the plain Jane, and the other one is the one that you can mount all your goodies on. We've got these two little gizmo gadgets that you can mount on the side of the saw for setting your fence down on, which is almost useless. And of course a wrench. And we got the anti-kickback feature. And what else in the Christmas stocking here? Okay, we've got some handles for cranking the knobs. You gotta have handles to crank your knobs, you know. So let's get those put on because those are easy. One for the changing the blade angle and one for the other thing. And these are the little things that I was questioning what they were. Those are the dealios that you set your fence on, which okay, now we're going to get on to putting these wing pieces on, whatever. This is kind of a neat little trick that I did here. You kind of put in one bolt upside down, and then that way you don't have to hold the whole thing on there while you're trying to put it together. So put one bolt on, tip it down, and then put the second bolt in and fill in the third, of course. And now I'm going to put a straight edge on here on both the front and the back, and then take some C-clamps and a little block of wood underneath and basically clamp it to flat. So I've got it clamped to the center, which I didn't really show me doing it, but it is clamped to the center, and then these C-clamps are going to clamp it flat. I've got a 17 millimeter wrench, and I'm going to just snug these ever so slightly so I can still tap that one way or the other. Up, one side, then the other side. And now I'm kind of doing the feely thing with my fingers on the front and the back to make sure it's perfectly lined up front to front. I found a little straight edge, putting that on there, and we'll give it a little wrap tap back and forth here to get it perfectly flush on the front primarily, and then we'll give it another little wrap tap up and down to try and get it flush. So you do have to have it not tight, but just tight enough so when you tap it, it doesn't just fall back down again. That's the trick here, is not go too crazy with it right away. So I'm basically putting this straight edge across there, and then checking for any wiggle. I suppose one could say that I was being too persnickety here, but I'd rather have this thing as flat as possible. And then now I'm tightening the bolts, which of course I discovered were kind of on the soft side because, well, it never stopped tightening as far as I could tell. I run my finger right here, get this side nice and even. I get over here nice and even, but in the center, I can feel a ridge as I go inward there toward the blade, which tells me that either this is like that or this is like that. I would have thought that everything was ground flat. Maybe there's some tension built into this, I don't know. So I've double, triple checked and turned boxes upside down, and I haven't found these things. They're hiding. These bolts that hold the wings on, right there. So I hate to say it, but when I tightened those down, you know, they just kind of had that Chinese feel, like you could keep tightening them forever without a lot of force, and they would just strip out. So it's almost like I wanted to put a nut on the backside and help it out a little bit. In the tube. So you'll find there's a couple of angle iron pieces. One goes on the driver's side of the saw, I'll call it, and the other one goes on the outfeed side of the saw. So here I'm just putting this one on the infeed side first. And again, just snuggling these bolts in to the point where they kind of hold things, but I can move the angle iron up and down. And I'll just put them like a little bit beyond finger tight, but not completely tight. And then I took my square and set it to what seemed to be a happy medium distance, and basically tried to make the thing completely level from one end to the other relative to the top of the table saw. So here you can see me just kind of giving it a little love tap up and down and gradually tightening the screws until I was satisfied that everything was in line with the top of the table saw. And yeah, a little more aggressive with a block of wood there, double checking again. So we're just kind of keeping on doing this. I guess this is the outfeed side, but same drill pretty much, in feed and out feed side. So you just got to remember that this rail is going to extend out, and then if you have that added piece on the one side of your table to put in, that piece right there, you'll see that you will also be mounting that piece onto those same angle irons. So here I'm using the same trick again, just extending out a couple of straight edges, which are some good square tubing, clamping up to that, and then drilling my holes and putting the screws in and whatnot. So that was pretty easy. And then here, mounting the switch, there's 3 bolts in the top, pretty straightforward. Screw them all in, dishes are done. And then we've got this guy here, which is what your fence grabs onto, goes back and forth. So here I want to take and make sure that it's parallel with the front of the table all the way across, or I guess probably more importantly, perpendicular to the saw blade and the grooves in the table, or the slots in the table, right? So we're doing a little adjusting, tightening down, and that, for reference, is the block of wood, which is like slightly under an inch. I think you could just use an inch or whatever. Putting on the cover, putting in our little insert thingamabob here, and then you got to go around and adjust these little Allen key screws until it's exactly flat with the table, which I think is pretty important to do, because otherwise, especially if you're cutting a small piece in there, you know, the small piece could be entirely riding on that thing, right? So we got that set, and then ready to put a blade in here. One thing I did notice with the what do you call it, the arbor there, the threaded piece, is that was extremely tight to the blade. I actually took and just filed that down ever so slightly, just like by a half a thousandth, to make the blade slightly easier to put on. It's not the final position of the blade, but it's just going across the threads that were was kind of tight. Running my square along here to make sure that the blade is actually square with the saw, because if the blade isn't square with the groove on the table, that's kind of an issue, right? Now you'll see this little trick that I do here. I'm going to put the stickum measuring thing on, which thankfully is in US units and no metric. That's a good thing. So I clamped it on to where I needed it, and then started to undo the tape underneath of it, and kind of pulled the backer off from underneath. Now, why I covered my hands doing this, or covered it with my hands, I don't know, but you'll see what I do here in a second. See the backer coming out and me just pushing it down. The one thing we got to do something about is the fact that it seemingly didn't come with any feet for it. And I'm going to use this big chunk of rubber and cut some pads out of this and attach them with bolts to the bottom of the four corners of this thing. I have since sold this Grizzly drill press because it is a weak-kneed, weak piece of junk. So it's not in the shop anymore. Don't cringe too hard. Those Forstner bits are not all that great. They barely cut wood, but we can waste them on this piece of rubber and not feel too bad about it. So here I'm just going to put these on the bottom before we actually set this thing down on the concrete. Well, we'll drop the fence down on here, and you can see there's a little bit of a wiggle when I tighten it down. I'll explain that in a second. And we've got adjustment screws on either side for getting it square to the tabletop, and also square to the blade or to the grooves in the table. And so you can see this little guy right here, which is basically a strip of metal, has a slight amount of play in it. I just need to adjust both of those set screws in to the point where there's no play. Not really a huge deal. It ends up completely square, but that play is kind of a little bit of a nuisance, I think. Future Andrew here, and I was almost remiss in not talking a little bit more about these safety accessories here, the riving knives, the anti-kickback feature, the blade guard, and so on. So let's go over them quickly, and then I'm also going to give you my comments on this guy right here, which I haven't really used all that much because I'm not super impressed with it. Anyway, let's see how these riving knives are installed here. It's very simple. I'm going to take out the plate here and then raise up the blade. And once the blade is raised up, you can see there's a little lever down in here. Actually, I can just, it's like a cam action thing that you can loosen and tighten. And you can turn this around to make it tighter or looser. And that's where you put your riving knife in. So I'm going to take my riving knife and install it in there. It just slips right down in. And then once it slips in, all you have to do is cam this thing over. One thing I noticed is this riving knife is bent slightly to the right-hand side of the saw. So I guess there's an assumption that you're always cutting on the one side of the blade, and that's probably true 99.9% of the time. But for whatever reason, this one is slightly bent, and the other riving knife that's used to mount the blade guard, etc., is dead straight with the blade. So I'm curious if anybody has a comment about that, why this would be bent one way or the other, or why it would assume that I would necessarily cut on one side of the blade than the other. I mean, I'm a right-handed guy, so yeah, I'm probably going to do things this way all the time, and that's what most people will likely do. But there's nothing that says that you couldn't rip something on the other side of the saw here. So why it is one way and not centered, I'm not sure. I thought about bending it straight in my press. I just haven't done that yet because I don't use this riving knife very often at all, if I've ever used it. And then we'll put this one here in, and this is the one that we can mount our blade guard, etc. on. So very simple. Put that in there, tighten that down, and that one is nice and straight with the blade. So a difference there, much better. Let's put this back in. And then I'll lower the blade a little bit here, make it more reasonable. Next I'm going to put this on, which is the anti-kickback feature. And for this one here, there is a button on one side here. Basically, it's a very simple little mechanism. It has a spring in here. You press the button and it releases on the inside, so you can slip it onto the riving knife piece there. And so we'll do that. To install this, I simply dropped it down in here, found the groove, and press the button to drop it all the way down in, and now it's locked in. Next, I'll install the blade guard, and the mechanism is pretty much the same. There's just one mounting point on this riving knife here, and there's a button right here that you push in again to allow it to click into place. So usually what I do is I'll lift this side, or maybe I'll lift both sides up a little bit and drop that down in there, so I can get it right. There we go. Drop that in, push the button, let it fall down in, click in place like that, and then I can drop these down. And that's ready to go now. So you crank that up and down once. The miter gauge was sort of a downer for one particular reason, and unfortunately the most important particular reason, and that is the fact that when you loosen the handle to adjust it, there's all kinds of play in the stops. So here I am at 0 degrees. I should be getting a perfect 90 degrees to the blade, and if I wiggle this thing one way or the other, it can be as much as 1/8 of an inch out at a foot. And I consider that to be quite a bit off. That, even woodworking, that is a lot off in my opinion. 1/8 of an inch out at a foot. So you're left with having to put a square on this every time to set it, and worse yet, of course, if you're trying to set an angle. I mean, perpendicular is perpendicular, that's kind of easy, but if I want to go at 30 degrees or 60 degrees at the extreme maybe, or 45 degrees, I'm left with having to set that angle every single time. I don't want to do that. The chances of me using this miter gauge very often are probably slim to none. The other comment that I'll make on it is that when you do go to adjust it, this little goofy little knob right here, which doesn't have any knurling on it or anything, is kind of hard to pull actually. And then you pull it, okay? And it's kind of grindy in there. It's like you're grinding the gears, right? So the whole thing is made poorly, I would say, overall, in spite of its features. Like, it's got this thing that you can loosen up and adjust. It's kind of like a faceplate type thing. You can loosen up and slide back and forth, and that's got like a T-track on every side of it, which could be handy. But I just don't see myself using this particular miter gauge very often because of this particular issue here. I built a sled. I'd much rather use the sled than this for now. Only a rare occasion will I ever use this guy right here. And eventually I'll probably go someplace and find one that I really like and buy it and replace this. It just isn't that good. And now this is going to be one of the bigger disappointments. I guarantee you that Ryobi saw would have never kicked out right there. Not even close. I mean, you could have run that thing till you almost stopped it, and it wouldn't kick out like this. Whether it's people or machines, I kind of like things that try hard, and things that give out easy are disappointing to me. Wrapping this up, would I buy the saw again? Yes, I think I would buy this saw again. Is it 100%? No, there's negatives to it, and let's just go through those real quick. Number one, this guy right here, this miter gauge, take that thing and take it out of the box, hang it on the wall, and then go buy a real miter gauge if you are inclined to use a miter gauge a lot. The reason being is that you cannot set an exact zero on this thing, or a 30 degrees, a 45 degrees, any of those. You gotta check it every single time, and I just don't think that you should have to check 0 degrees on this every time you use it. What a pain in the rear to do, right? So that's the negative. Fasteners, nuts, bolts, whatever. One of those things that it's made out of soft metal, appears to come from somewhere around the opposite side of the globe, where they apparently don't care about metal quality and the hardness of materials like I would expect that they should care about them. So that's kind of a minor negative. The fact that the motor gave out and kicked out when we weren't really pushing it that hard, that's a little bit disconcerting. But I'm going to try and switch this to 220 at some point, and I hope that that helps with that situation. I don't know. I will know when I do it and when I give it a test and prove it out. I would like to see it try a little harder, you know. I really would. But other than that, it's a pretty good. Oh yeah, and this riving knife being slightly bent. I've got a big hydraulic press. I will fix that. But yeah, it could have came straight. That would have been a better plan. You know, you don't want to stick your piece of wood through here and then it gets stuck on the end of the riving knife because the riving knife is bent. That's negative. All right, so all my complaints, but it cuts beautifully. You know, if I do a good job of setting it up flat and perpendicular and setting up my fence so the fence lands on square and all of that every time, most of that is on me, and I think I've done a good job of that so far. I've been happy with the way that it cuts. No complaints 99% of the time. Those other things, hey, other saws are probably going to have
comparable issues, maybe slightly different, but nothing's ever perfect, nothing's ever 100%. It is what it is. Yes, I would probably buy this saw again, but luckily I already have it, so I don't have to buy it again. I just got to buy a different tool. And there is a different tool coming, so stay tuned and we will do a review on that tool, and that's more exciting than this tool.